If you ask someone in the West to define the Buddhist concept of emptiness, you'll usually get a description of a void, a heavy, dissociative black hole where meaning and identity go to die. That misunderstanding comes from conflating three distinct ideas. Early Buddhist philosophy mapped the mind using two main tools: anicca, the observation that all things are impermanent, and anatta, the realization that because things constantly change, humans lack a permanent, fixed ego. Later philosophers identified a deeper cognitive illusion, svabhava. This is the assumption that things possess inherent, independent existence. It is the brain's habit of assuming that objects, people, and concepts exist entirely on their own, from their own side. This chart maps the progression toward śūnyatā, or emptiness. Emptiness is the total, radical absence of svabhava. It argues that neither the subjective observer nor the objective world possesses any independent essence. This view collapses the dualism between the observer and the observed entirely. Everything exists, but only in relation to everything else. Emptiness refers to a lack of rigid boundaries, rather than a lack of meaning. When we misinterpret it as a void, we take a highly sophisticated framework for liberation and turn it into a trap of existential dread. The definition of emptiness wasn't established in a single moment of dogma. It evolved through centuries of intense scholastic debate. We can track this evolution through three distinct leaps in Buddhist thought: the Abhidhamma of the Theravāda school, the Madhyamaka school of Nāgārjuna, and the Yogacara school. These competing ancient philosophies operate as early, rigorous attempts at mapping human cognitive architecture. To understand how they work, we will trace the evolution of emptiness across these three schools, cross-examining them against modern clinical psychology and fMRI data. Treating these texts as neurocognitive blueprints rather than theology reveals exactly how the human brain processes a non-dual reality. Let's start with the Theravāda Abhidhamma. This system maps reality through an analytical approach, breaking conventional experience down into basic atom-like constituents called dhammas. The Theravāda school asserts that while these dhammas lack a self, they still function as the pragmatically real building blocks of our moment-to-moment experience. This text shows the logical critique launched by the Madhyamaka school and its founder, Nāgārjuna. He challenged the premise that independent building blocks exist at all. Nāgārjuna laid out a strict logical trap. If any physical or mental object actually had an unchanging core essence, a true svabhava, it would be frozen. It could never interact with its environment, change over time, or be affected by cause and effect. Since things change, Nāgārjuna offered pratitya samutpada, or dependent origination. Phenomena exist only in dynamic relationship to causes. This passage clarifies emptiness is not a hidden realm, nor a creator deity. It's merely a characteristic of how things exist. Under the Madhyamaka framework, even the concept of emptiness is empty. It is simply a description of infinite relationality, dismantling the idea that an objective, independent universe sits waiting to be perceived. The problem with Nāgārjuna's radical emptiness is that inexperienced practitioners misread it as pure nihilism. The Yogacara school recognized this danger and developed a structural correction. They introduced tris svabhava, or the three natures, using a classic metaphor, walking into a dark room and seeing a rope. The first is imagined nature. Human cognition superimposes false, dualistic threats over neutral reality. You look at a rope, but your brain projects a snake. The second is the dependent nature. This represents the underlying causal stream of consciousness itself. It is the raw physical data, the rope, acting as the required basis for your brain to project anything onto in the first place. The third is the consummate nature. This is the realization of reality completely emptied of the imagined subject-object dualism. You perceive the data without the projection. The Yogacara insight is highly mechanical. Without that dependent flow of consciousness acting as a physical basis, the brain would have no screen to project on. Neither delusional suffering nor ultimate liberation would be biologically possible. In the 21st century, the late meditation teacher Rob Burbea translated these ancient scholastic models into highly pragmatic instructions. Burbea's methodology relies on ways of looking. He posited that human perception is never objective. It is strictly dictated by the cognitive frame the observer applies in any given moment. He introduced the concept of fabrication. Rather than treating a deluded mind and an enlightened mind as a binary switch, fabrication acts as a variable dial. Turn the dial up and you get high fabrication states. The self feels rigid and external threats feel solid, creating massive psychological friction. Turn the dial down and perception becomes fluid and highly relational. Meditation practitioners reach this state of emptiness through the systematic, mechanical process of intentionally dialing down cognitive fabrication. We can locate the specific biological hardware that generates this fabrication. It's the brain's default mode network. When you aren't performing a specific task, this network defaults to on. It is the engine behind your constant, wandering, self-referential narrative. This network relies on two core centers, the posterior cingulate cortex and medial prefrontal cortex. These power subsidiary networks. One handles spatial mapping between self and other. The second handles chronological mapping, tracking the self into the past and future. This monitor shows real-time fMRI data of experienced non-dual meditators engaging in śūnyatā practice. The scan reveals a cascading effect. As central cores de-energize, subsidiary networks shut down. The brain biologically halts the perception of a separate self. The experience of oneness and living strictly in the present moment emerges as the direct, measurable output of the default mode network going offline. We see this exact dynamic mirrored in modern clinical interventions, specifically acceptance and commitment therapy. Therapists use a technique called cognitive diffusion. It serves as the clinical equivalent of emptiness, training patients to treat their thoughts as transient neurological events rather than absolute truths. If we pivot back to philosophy, we have to address the ultimate endpoint of this practice. The Kyoto school provides a precise interpretation of what absolute emptiness actually entails. They call it being save nothingness. This absolute negation perfectly aligns with reality. True śūnyatā removes the neurological friction preventing observers from experiencing reality as it is. Which brings us back to Rob Burbia to address the final, lingering fear. If you live with a fully deactivated default mode network, does the world just become gray, flat, and entirely meaningless? He described the exact opposite. He called it re-enchantment, explaining that complete defabrication actually restores wonder to perception. When you experience a world devoid of rigid boundaries, the environment ceases to be isolated objects. It becomes a groundless, highly spontaneous display. While a beginner might fear the loss of ego, a master relies on that loss to experience an unburdened, total interconnectedness. The realization of emptiness functions as the biological and philosophical mechanism required to experience total fullness.